everyone. David Aronson, Senior Product Marketing over here at Shield, here with Grant Ballou, Sales Manager at Shield. How are you doing today, Grant?
Doing great, David. How about yourself?
Oh, awesome. Okay, so this we're actually kicking off a really cool project here. This is our new financial compliance in focus. Because who wants to sit for a webinar for about an hour and 30 minutes? Okay, so we're going to try to keep things snappy over here. We are going to talk today about mobile communications and financial compliance. Hot topic. It's always been a hot topic. Probably will
Yes,
always be
that's
a
for
hot
sure.
topic. Yeah. I mean, and it's been like over talked about, I think, at this point, like, are the fines and what does it mean next? But somehow, like, we're still kind of in this question mode. Like, we don't see necessarily like a whole bunch of people buying up all these solutions. There's some weird stuff going on. So I've got a question for you, Grant, today. Why
Sure.
isn't everyone solving this? Every vendor claims that they can easily solve it. It's not solved. What's up with that?
No, and I think you bring up a great point earlier, right? This is a question that's been going on for my 12 years in mobility and compliance. And I think you really have to start with the big question, how do we message clients? That's what we're asking. That's what the industry's asking. And we all want to solve that. But you have to take a step back and think about, the means in which we communicate in business, both internally and externally, has greatly changed. Gone are the days when voice calls were the primary means. Then came email, which is obviously still relevant, but now it is all about mobile messaging. You know, I think about the estimated monthly numbers of 6 billion people using messengers, which includes iMessage, text message, Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, and all the others. And then the fact that over 20% of that communication is business related. And this is a channel that's not going away, not going to be going away, and it has to get resolved. So the next phase of that is the governance of all those channels, and it's seemingly nowhere to be found, which leads to enormous disparities and specifically two gaps in both compliance and data ownership. And I think that's why many firms still forbid mobile messaging completely. But that isn't the answer either, because frankly, that mobile messaging is the preferred means of communication for the large portion of buyers. In fact, I was reading a study done by, I think it was Jennifer Aker at Stanford Graduate School, I believe, and they found that there's a significant increase in the likelihood of closing a particular deal if there's a mobile messaging engagement with the economic buyer. So I understand why the want and really the need of the sales force to use this channel of communication. And when you look at it from a business perspective, there are numerous benefits and results. You think about the percentages I mentioned a second ago, there is value economically and from a productivity standpoint for every organization. Yeah, I put it in a personal spotlight and think about it. I hate to admit it, but my phone is next to me 20 plus hours a day. It's there when I wake up. It's actually what wakes me up with the alarm clock. When I'm on vacation, I still have my personal phone, which has my work email on it. So I'm always plugged in. Whether my wife and kids think that's so great is another story. But you get my point that because I have my phone and mobility, I'm more productive. And I say all this because I don't believe the majority of messaging is intentionally used for malicious purposes. I think of it more as from the sales perspective that messaging provides significant opportunity and flexibility and furthermore value. So that said, there are bad actors and regulatory requirements that we have to be aware of. And what we must solve is those two big gaps I mentioned earlier, data ownership and compliance.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting insight, Grant. I mean, you're saying like this is a sales tool. I need this
Yep.
to sell.
Yeah.
Um, and we were just talking about this before the call about like from like the data side. So like let's say you didn't have all these problems and somehow like you did like magically, solve all this, then you've got like even more problems because like now you've got all this new data now pouring in and
Yeah.
whatever
What are
the
you going to
data
do with it?
structure that's coming in.
Yep.
Yeah. So now you're gonna have to like first of all, you have to archive it and capture an archive, and then you gotta actually like survey it and then you got like, wait a second. So now I've got all these I've got all my false positives
The
I'm doing it
supervision on it.
anyway.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Oh my
Exactly.
gosh, like
Exactly.
what's this gonna look like? And we hear this a lot from our own customers, like, okay, what's gonna be on the other side? We need to be careful because it's a problem both ways. If you don't capture it and you do capture it.
It really
So
is.
what's the solution?
That's the proverbial $1 million question, right? Then
The $2.1 billion question.
yeah, precisely. We've seen that so much lately. I think it starts with each individual organization and clearly defining a policy around mobility. You know, whether you're wanting to employ a corporate issued rollout or a BYOD strategy, there has to be a strong plan and policy in place. And then furthermore, you take it one step and say, what's the training on these policies and procedures? We work, with financial institutions around the world, and um, they have to adhere to some of the most stringent regulations of any industry. They have experienced IT teams that know the risk and the need for compliance, but because of the beneficial economic factors I mentioned earlier, there's really some kind of unspoken influence on how to manage. I wouldn't say there's a blind eye turn to it, per se. Um, but because of the complexity of messaging, every organization is searching for, this perfect solution. And I don't think it's there yet.
Yeah, and the fact is, look, I mean, that avalanche of data that we keep talking about, like, no matter which way you look at this, we have to solve it.
Yep.
And I think we got to this point in the conversation now where we have to do what I like to call our 5 and 5. We're going to ask 5 questions, and we're going to pretend like I have a clock, and we're going to try to get like 1 minute under each one. Okay. So speaking of
Yeah,
snappy,
let's before we do that, let's talk. I want to talk a little bit about like kind of the, really more or less to answer your question directly, what is the solution? And I think whether we want to admit it or not, there is a, the blanket no text and policy is not going to work, right? Employees are going to circumvent the policy, and that may be simply not knowing or carelessness, or as I mentioned, bad actors. But I don't believe that, as I said, most of the messaging is malicious, and I think most employees would be fine with capturing and storing business conversations, right? And that's where the data ownership comes into play. But the issue becomes when the compliance requirements become too much of a burden to make the channel of communication valuable, right? There are a number of solutions that provide some form of capturing these messaging channels. 4 off the top of my head, I think, you have network integrators where they get a copy of your messages and calls directly from the operator network side, which then that excludes iMessage. You have dual phone number options where there's personal and business number on a single device and all business communication is captured, which you receive pushback obviously from the field because they want to use the same number that they've had for the relationship with their customers and clients on. There's bots that can be added into these native messaging apps as a third member to capture the information, which is a little cumbersome. And then lastly, you're seeing more and more now that there's these options that have a consumer version and an official version of the same app on devices, which requires the user to use the appropriate app at the appropriate time. So I think no matter what solution is deployed, the important question then arises to what you said, what do we do with all this data? Are we partnered with the right archiving, surveillance, and supervision vendor that can ingest and then intelligently alert on these communications? The lasting risk management and compliance, as you know, that they want is more false positive alerts. And then being able to have a holistic approach of organizing the conversation timelines and looking at multiple channels, as there is channel hopping inevitably for e-discovery purposes. So I'll leave you with this and we'll jump into the 5x5. I really wish that there was some easy, Nirvana approach to it. Here's the solution. We're good to go. It's just not the case. But I think with the right policies, procedures, and ultimately training in place, you can make an effective solution for your organization.
Aren't you just like a ray of sunshine today? I mean, we do have some solutions, right? There are ways to do this. There's a little bit of like how and which way to do it, and there's a pros and cons, and like you said, we also need to really keep an eye down the road. Like, what happens if we actually do this? What's going to happen to all of our compliance teams? Okay, so
long-term picture,
yeah, absolutely. All right, let's do the 5 and 5. Question 1. Have we banned mobile out of existence?
No, mobile messaging is here to stay, and it's only growing, right? So getting a plan in place, as I said, the no texting policy is not going to work. It's a preferred channel of communication, and then it's only going to grow moving forward.
It's a sales tool. We need our sales tools.
Yes.
Okay. So policies now. didn't work for banning. Do they still have a place?
100%. And I think that really starts with kind of creating an internal focus team that brings stakeholders from every role to say, hey, what does the landscape look like? What do we need to do? What's going to be best for our organization? And then clearly defining that so that it is digestible, and then reinforcing it on a consistent basis at all levels of the organization to really ensure that there's, that first layer of the user compliance before you can do it. You can have all the policies in place, but if our teams aren't aware of it, it's really not doing a whole lot.
So everyone and their grandmother has announced that they have a solution. Okay.
And there'll be another one tomorrow, I'm sure. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So you've told us the pros and cons to each one. So what do you do?
Yeah, I think once you've identified internally through these stakeholder conversations what's going to be the best plan in place, you have to partner with the right vendor. There's I mentioned kind of the 4 routes you can go earlier, but ensuring that the vendor you ultimately select meets this checklist that you've clearly laid out in a mobility assessment, we'll say, is checking all those boxes. And then really, what is that vendor's outlook going forward? Are they innovative? Do they have a unique approach to solving some of these problems? And are they going to listen to your feedback as an organization of what are your pain points and working together to find those solutions?
So what other factors should we be looking at?
Yeah, the usability. I think the UX and the UI of any of those systems, the user experience, that it's simplified, it's usable, it's not putting additional hurdles in this communication channel, the governance of it, what's our long-term strategy, what if the API shifts, product roadmap, things along those lines as far as the innovation and understanding all that.
Okay. The ultimate question, is there a gotcha that people need to look out for?
Well, how much of a mess do you want to clean up after you ingest all this data, right? And so I think the gotcha is once we do get all this data, we have our plan in place. We know mobile messaging is here to stay. We've got a plan and a policy. We've selected our vendor. We're looking at the long-term, perspective. How are we ensuring that once we have this data, that it's in a digestible format, that we can, utilize surveillance, e-discovery, and supervision? So, what's coming out the other end is what you really have to look at. And once you've kind of gone down this pecking order of what we need to accomplish from a mobility landscape.
Amazing. Thank you, Grant. This was an awesome conversation. Let's keep the
No, I
conversation
appreciate
going.
it, David.
Yeah, let's keep this going. Hit up our website. Let's have a chat. There's a lot to discuss. We're here to help. This is Shield Financial Compliance in Focus. You didn't spend an hour 30. You got a lot out of it. I think this is the way of the future. This
Time
is
and
innovation.
efficiency.
Am I right, Grant?
That's right. Oh, 100%. Thanks for spending some time, David.
Amazing. And thank you for watching.